Well, a change of policy equals a change of plans for migrants from Venezuela hoping to enter the United States. Up to 24,000 Venezuelan migrants will now be able to catch a flight to the U.S. Those migrants will be allowed to stay in the country for up to 2 years. In turn, Venezuelans who try to enter the country illegally at the southern border will be sent back to Mexico. And we go now to Simon Hankinson, Senior Fellow on Border Security and Immigration at the Heritage Foundation. Simon, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. So why the sudden move to greenlight some migrants and not others?
Well, I hate to be cynical and say politics, but I think the disaster that's unfolding in cities like New York and Washington that's getting a lot of Democratic mayors in trouble is turning the White House's attention to what Texas and Arizona and California and border states have known for a very long time, which is that we have a horrible situation at the southern border with millions of people coming in without any sort of control.
Yeah, and I know that you recently returned from a trip to Texas where you visited the southern border. Tell us about what you saw and some of the troubling trends as far as deadly drugs getting into the U.S.
Yeah, I went to Texas, to San Antonio, Del Rio, and Eagle Pass on the border. And what we saw was a steady flow of thousands of people. We didn't see all the thousands coming across, but you can see the remains of clothes and water bottles and flip-flops and things right across the border. And the drugs, the first day I was there was an article about a teenage girl who died of a fentanyl overdose. She's one of 107,000 Americans that have died of drug overdoses last year, about 70% from fentanyl and synthetic opioids. So what's happening down there is an utter disaster for the local communities, but it's feeding into the rest of the country thanks to this, what I call the Mayorkas migration machine, these giant tent city and processing centers where they process people as quickly as possible and then pump them into the interior.
Yeah, and what about the journey itself to cross the border? Can you talk to us about that and also more about what you found when you were down there?
Well, the journey varies, I think, from person to person. There are some who come all the way up through South America, over the Darien Gap. It's a very dangerous crossing. There have been over 750 people who've died trying to get in to the United States in the last year, and who knows how many have died on the journey. But there are others who just buy a plane ticket into Mexico City, and then they take a nice bus up to the border and pay a smuggler to take them over. So there's just a whole different list of ways that you can get into the country because there are so many different open spaces. We did find one particular.
Yeah, and Simon,
yeah. Go ahead.
Continue.
I was going to say we found some documents that had been abandoned by people. There was one from a Venezuelan man, we think, who had been in Peru, probably as a refugee, as a temporary resident, and he'd abandoned his card because he wanted to try his luck in the United States instead. And that is a pattern we've seen with the Haitians who were already well established in Chile, but they decided that they would try their luck in the United States when it seemed like the border was open, essentially.
Simon, given this risk, to human life, do you have any idea why the administration maybe isn't doing more to try and stop this influx?
Well, I think there are a couple of reasons. One is ideology. There are people in this administration who just genuinely believe that we shouldn't have borders, that international borders are a bad idea. And they don't really count the consequences downstream of the costs to the U.S. of absorbing millions of people all at one time. They have policies that they try to put in place, like what they call addressing the root causes, which means throwing billions of dollars into countries like Guatemala, El Salvador, and so on, to try to build up their economies and fight corruption and things. These are all laudable goals. I'm not against that. But to expect that to have any kind of results in the short term is just unrealistic.
And Simon, before I let you go, we have probably about 30 seconds left or so, but I know earlier this week you broke some news about Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas and his response to that whipping controversy involving U.S. Border Patrol agents that took place last year. Can you quickly talk to us more about that and what happened?
Yeah, that was a shameful, I think, dereliction of his duty to stand up for his agents in the field. These Border Patrol guys, largely Hispanic as it happens, were on horseback because that's the easier way to do their jobs. They didn't have whips. They had reins, and they were trying to stop people from crossing into the river and possibly risking their lives to get into the United States. The media blew it completely out of proportion, and the secretary failed to say what he knew at the time, which was that they had not been whipping anybody, that they had simply been trying to do their jobs.
Well, Simon, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us about all this. We really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure.